And the clockmaker's burden, the morning frost of December 1943, clung to the windows of Klaus Brenner's cramped workshop in Oberndorf, Bavaria, as his weathered hands traced the cold steel of what would become history's most precise battlefield instrument. Outside, the thunder of Allied bombers shook the very foundations of the Reich, but inside this room, surrounded by metal shavings and half-finished rifle barrels, a clockmaker's son was about to perfect a weapon that would define an era of warfare. The KAR98k lay before him, not just another rifle, but the culmination of a lifetime spent understanding the marriage between mathematics and mortality. Klaus had never intended to become an architect of death. Born in 1898 to a family of Bavarian clockmakers, he had spent his childhood surrounded by the delicate mechanisms that measured time itself. The war had revealed a brutal truth that every weapons engineer now understood. Battles were no longer won by courage alone, but by precision at impossible distances. On the Eastern Front, Soviet snipers were decimating German officers from ranges that seemed almost mythical. In North Africa, British marksmen were turning single shots into strategic victories. The Wehrmacht's standard-issue rifles were adequate for infantry charges, but utterly inadequate for the emerging art of long-range elimination. Klaus adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and ran his thumb along the rifle's bolt mechanism. Each component had been hand-finished to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches, a precision that his father Johann would have appreciated. The old clockmaker had taught him that precision was not just a skill, it was a philosophy. Every gear must know its purpose, his father used to say, and every spring must trust its tension. Those words echoed in Klaus's mind as he applied the same meticulous care to instruments of war that his family had once reserved for chronometers. When the Great War erupted in 1914, 16-year-old Klaus had watched his three brothers march away to trenches that would swallow them whole. Only Klaus returned from that war, carrying shrapnel in his left shoulder and an obsession with the weapons that had failed his family so catastrophically. For 2 decades, he had worked in anonymity at the Mauser factory, a quiet man whose suggestions were routinely dismissed by engineers who confused academic credentials with battlefield wisdom. His colleagues saw a clockmaker pretending to understand warfare. His supervisors saw a peasant's son overstepping his station. But Klaus saw something they couldn't, that the difference between life and death on a battlefield often measured less than 2 millimeters. The breakthrough had come during a moment of absolute desperation. In late 1943, as casualty reports from Stalingrad painted a picture of military collapse, Klaus was summoned to examine a captured Soviet Mosin Nagant that had been responsible for eliminating an entire German command staff. As he disassembled the weapon, his clockmaker's instincts recognized something the military experts had missed. The rifle's extraordinary accuracy came not from superior engineering, but from meticulous hand-finishing of components that mass production had rendered crude. Now, working 18-hour shifts in his workshop, Klaus had begun applying clockmaking techniques to rifle manufacturing. He developed a method for hand-lapping each barrel to tolerances that bordered on the obsessive. He redesigned the trigger mechanism using principles borrowed from chronometer escapements. Most revolutionary of all, he created a system for individually matching each rifle's components, barrel, action, and trigger, like pieces of a single, deadly timepiece. The first prototype had failed spectacularly. The second exploded during testing, nearly blinding Klaus in his right eye. But this third rifle, completed in February 1944, achieved something that bordered on the impossible: consistent accuracy at ranges exceeding 800 meters. As Klaus made his final adjustments, the scent of gun oil and metal shavings filled the cold Bavarian air. Outside, another wave of bombers passed overhead, their engines drowning out the gentle tick of his father's old workshop clock that still hung on the wall. Soon, he would demonstrate this weapon to skeptical military officials at a testing range outside Munich. He had no way of knowing that the silence following each shot would speak louder than any applause, or that his pursuit of perfection would force an entire war to become more careful, more paranoid, more precise in its brutality. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. What drives a man to perfect the tools of his own torment? The testing range outside Munich stretched across a frost-covered meadow, marked by wooden targets at distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of marksmen. Klaus arrived in an army truck on a bitter February morning in 1944, carrying his modified KAR98k in a canvas case that bore the wear of countless hours in his workshop. Oberst Heinrich Müller, the range commander, greeted Klaus with barely concealed skepticism. The officer's uniform bore the crisp authority of the Wehrmacht, but his eyes held the weariness of a man who had seen too many miracle weapons fail to live up to their promises. Another clockmaker's fantasy, Müller muttered to his aide, loud enough for Klaus to hear. We need rifles for soldiers, not music boxes for collectors. Klaus said nothing. He had learned over 2 decades at the Mauser factory that his work would have to speak for itself. As he unpacked the rifle, the morning light caught the subtle differences in its construction. Where standard KAR98ks bore the rough finish marks of mass production, Klaus's weapon showed the patient hand finishing that made each component fit with chronometer precision. The first shot rang across the meadow at 400 meters. The bullet struck dead center of the target. Müller's aide made a note on his clipboard, unimpressed. Standard rifles could manage such accuracy on a calm morning. The second shot followed at 600 meters. Again, dead center. Now Müller leaned forward, adjusting his binoculars. At 800 meters, Klaus fired 5 rounds in succession. Through the field glasses, the observers watched each bullet pass through the same hole. The silence that followed spoke louder than any applause. At distances where other rifles scattered shots across targets like scattered prayers, Klaus's perfected KAR98k placed bullet after bullet with mechanical precision. Impossible, whispered Müller's aide. But Klaus was already demonstrating the weapon's most revolutionary feature. He had created a system for individually matching each rifle's components, barrel, action, and trigger like pieces of a single timepiece. No 2 rifles were identical, yet each achieved the same impossible accuracy through his painstaking process. What happened in the next 7 minutes would quietly change the war forever. Müller ordered immediate mass production trials. Within weeks, reports began filtering back from the field. German snipers equipped with Klaus's hand-finished rifles were achieving kill ratios that defied military logic. On the Normandy beaches, a single marksman with a Brenner-modified KAR98k eliminated 17 Allied officers in one afternoon, forcing an entire battalion to halt its advance. In the Ardennes forest, 3 snipers using Klaus's rifles disrupted supply lines for weeks, turning individual soldiers into strategic weapons. But precision, Klaus discovered, was a double-edged sword. As reports of the rifle's effectiveness spread, both sides began adapting their tactics. Officers removed insignia. Command posts moved constantly. The art of camouflage evolved from mere concealment to elaborate deception. Klaus had created a weapon so effective that it forced an entire war to become more careful, more paranoid, more precise in its brutality. Back in his workshop in Oberndorf, Klaus received promotion orders and requests for increased production. Each rifle required nearly 40 hours of individual attention, hand-lapping barrels, adjusting trigger mechanisms, matching components with the patience his father had taught him for clock springs and gears. The work was driving him toward exhaustion, but the letters from the field kept coming. One letter, from a sniper named Wilhelm, stationed near Caen, particularly haunted him. The soldier wrote of hitting targets at ranges that had seemed impossible just months before, but also of the psychological weight of such precision. Every shot was now a measured, calculated taking of life, no longer the chaotic spray of infantry combat, but something approaching surgical execution. Klaus began leaving his workshop only to attend Mass at the small Catholic church in Oberndorf, seeking absolution for talents that had transformed craftsmanship into carnage. His hands, once steady enough to calibrate chronometer springs, began to shake. Each night he calculated the mathematics of his contribution to the war. How many lives his precision had ended, how many families his perfectionism had destroyed. The psychological weight of his creation was consuming him, even as military officials praised his breakthrough. Outside his workshop windows, the Bavarian countryside showed the first tentative signs of spring, but Klaus felt only the growing winter in his soul. How long can a man carry the weight of perfection when perfection means death? Spring arrived in Bavaria with unusual warmth in 1944, but Klaus Brenner felt no relief from the seasonal change. His workshop had become a place of pilgrimage for Wehrmacht officials, seeking to understand how a clockmaker's son had revolutionized battlefield accuracy. The production demands had grown beyond his capacity for individual attention, yet Klaus refused to compromise the precision that made each rifle unique. Letters from home had become a torment. His sister Greta wrote from Munich, describing the nightly bombing raids and the constant fear. His nephew Heinrich, barely 18, had been conscripted and stationed somewhere near the Eastern Front, location classified. Each letter carried an implicit question. Was Uncle Klaus's work helping to protect German boys, or was it simply making the killing more efficient? The boys at the front speak of your rifles like miracles, Greta had written. Heinrich says they call them Brenner angels because they never miss. But Klaus, I wonder sometimes if miracles are what we need, or if they are what we've become. The moral weight of those words pressed down on Klaus as he worked. Each rifle that left his workshop was hand-finished to tolerances that bordered on the obsessive, but now he knew exactly where they went and what they did. Reports filtered back through official channels, single shots disabling Allied tank commanders, sniper duels where his rifles gave German marksmen decisive advantages, strategic targets eliminated from ranges that had previously been considered safe. Dr. Elisabeth Weber, the camp physician who occasionally treated workers at the Mauser factory, began visiting Klaus's workshop more frequently. She had noticed the tremor in his hands, the weight loss, the dark circles under his eyes. A quiet woman in her 40s who had seen too much of war's medical consequences, she understood the particular burden that precision could place on a conscience. "Klaus," she said one afternoon, watching him adjust a trigger mechanism for the dozenth time, "there is such a thing as too much precision. Your father's clocks told time. These rifles, they end it." Klaus looked up from his work, his hands pausing over the delicate mechanism. Dr. Weber's words carried the authority of someone who had spent the war years treating wounds, not inflicting them. But he also heard in her voice a question that had been growing in his own mind. At what point did craftsmanship become complicity? The production pressure had intensified beyond sustainability. Military officials demanded hundreds of rifles with Klaus's modifications, but his process couldn't be replicated by ordinary factory workers. Each barrel required hand-lapping to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. Each trigger mechanism needed individual adjustment using principles borrowed from chronometer escapements. The system for matching components, barrel, action, and trigger, like pieces of a single timepiece, could only be accomplished by someone with Klaus's unique combination of skills and obsessive attention to detail. Wehrmacht engineers had tried to systematize his process, but their mass-produced versions achieved only half the accuracy. Klaus's rifles remained instruments of almost supernatural precision, while the factory copies were merely superior weapons. The difference meant that Klaus himself had become as strategic an asset as the weapons he created. Late one evening in June 1944, as news of the Normandy landings reached Oberndorf, Klaus sat in his workshop, surrounded by partially completed rifles and the growing weight of their implications. Outside, the Bavarian countryside showed the full glory of summer, but inside the cramped room, Klaus felt trapped in a winter that had nothing to do with seasons. He pulled out a letter from Wilhelm, the sniper stationed near Köln, that had arrived that morning. The soldier's handwriting had changed over the months, become more careful, more deliberate, as if the precision of his weapon had infected his penmanship. "Herr Brenner," the letter read, "your rifle has made me more than a soldier. It has made me something I don't have a name for. Yesterday, I eliminated a British officer from 850 meters. Through the scope, I could see his wedding ring. Your precision has given me the power to choose not just when to kill, but how to remember what I've done. Is this progress? Is this what your father meant about every spring trusting its tension? Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What would you remember more? The pride of perfect craftsmanship, or the weight of its consequences? Summer deepened in Bavaria as reports from the Western Front grew more desperate. Klaus's workshop had become a strange sanctuary, where the deliberate pace of precision work stood in stark contrast to the accelerating chaos of war. Each morning he would arrive before dawn and light the single candle that helped him examine the minute details of barrel finishing and trigger adjustment. The tremor in his hands had worsened, forcing him to modify his techniques. Where once he could hold tolerances to thousandths of inches through pure steadiness, now he relied increasingly on the mechanical aids his father had taught him for clock repair. Tiny vices, adjustable supports, anything that could compensate for the shake that had become a constant companion. Dr. Elizabeth Weber had begun timing her visits to coincide with Klaus's lunch breaks, concerned about the obvious deterioration in his health. She found him one afternoon in July, hunched over a rifle action, his usually precise movements showing signs of fatigue. "Klaus," she said gently, setting down a small basket containing bread and cheese from her own rations, "when did you last see sunlight?" He looked up, blinking as if her question required translation. The workshop had become his entire world, a place where time moved according to the requirements of precision rather than the demands of a war that seemed to be slipping away from German control. "The rifles," he said simply, gesturing to the dozen weapons in various stages of completion that surrounded his workbench. "They're expecting 50 more by the end of the month." Dr. Weber sat on a wooden stool that Klaus had originally used for examining clock movements. She had been treating more soldiers recently, not combat wounds, but the psychological casualties of a war that had moved beyond anyone's ability to control. Klaus's condition reminded her of the marksmen who came to her with what they called precision fatigue, the breakdown that occurred when human beings were required to be too accurate for too long. "What was your father's favorite clock?" she asked, seemingly changing the subject. Klaus paused in his work, his hands going still for the first time in hours. A Bavarian long-case clock, made in 1847. It ran for 50 years without needing major adjustment. "And what made it special?" "The escapement," Klaus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone remembering a happier time. "My father said it was designed to forgive small imperfections. The mechanism was precise enough to keep accurate time, but tolerant enough to keep running, even when conditions weren't perfect." Dr. Weber nodded thoughtfully. She had heard about Klaus's modifications to the KAR98k trigger mechanism, how he had adapted chronometer principles to create mechanical systems that eliminated human error from the firing process. But perhaps, she thought, some human error was meant to be preserved. News from the front had become increasingly grim. The Normandy beachhead had expanded beyond German ability to contain it. Reports suggested that Allied forces were preparing for a massive offensive that would threaten the entire Western Front. Klaus's rifles were having their intended effect. Individual German marksmen equipped with Brenner-modified weapons were achieving remarkable success rates, but the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. Wilhelm's letters had stopped coming in June, after the fall of Caen. Klaus had written to military authorities requesting information about the sniper's status, but received only form responses about operational security. The silence left him wondering whether his precision had ultimately protected Wilhelm or simply delayed an inevitable outcome. One evening in late July, as Klaus worked by candlelight to hand-lap a barrel to the exacting tolerances his process required, he found himself thinking about Dr. Weber's question regarding forgiveness. His father's clocks had been designed to accommodate the imperfections of a mechanical world, springs that stretched with age, gears that wore unevenly, escapements that needed room for tiny variations. But his rifles eliminated such tolerances. Every component was matched and finished to specifications that approached the theoretical limits of steel and wood. They were weapons that brooked no imperfection, demanded absolute precision from both manufacturer and user, and achieved accuracy that transcended normal human limitations. As the candle burned lower and the Bavarian night grew quiet around his workshop, Klaus began to wonder whether he had created instruments of war or monuments to an impossible standard that no human being should be required to meet. What happens when perfection becomes a burden too heavy for the soul to carry? August 1944 brought news that would reshape Klaus's understanding of everything he had created. Dr. Elizabeth Weber arrived at his workshop one morning carrying a leather satchel that she set down with unusual gravity. Inside were medical reports, letters and photographs that told a story Klaus had never been intended to see. "Klaus," she said quietly, "there are things about your rifles that you need to understand." The documents revealed the psychological impact of Klaus's precision on the men who used his weapons. Military physicians had begun documenting what they termed mechanical stress syndrome, a condition affecting snipers whose rifles achieved such consistent accuracy that every missed shot became a personal failing rather than an accepted limitation of equipment. Wilhelm's final letter, which had been delayed by military censors, painted a picture that haunted Klaus. The young sniper described how Klaus's rifle had transformed warfare into something resembling execution. The mechanical precision eliminated the random variables that had previously allowed soldiers to rationalize killing as necessary chaos. Now, every death was deliberate, calculated, chosen with mathematical certainty. "Herr Brenner," Wilhelm had written before his unit was overrun near Caen, "your rifle has made me precise enough to see my target's faces clearly at 800 meters. Yesterday I chose not to fire at a British medic who was treating wounded soldiers. The precision of your weapon gave me the power to choose mercy, but it also meant that every time I do choose to kill, I know exactly what I'm doing. I understand now why your father worked with clocks instead of weapons. Time moves forward regardless of our wishes. Your rifles make us responsible for every moment we choose to end." Doctor. Weber had collected similar testimonies from other snipers treated in field hospitals. Klaus's innovations had created weapons so accurate that they forced a level of moral responsibility onto their users that many human beings couldn't sustain. The psychological casualties were mounting, not from the chaos of combat, but from the terrible clarity his precision had introduced to warfare. But the most devastating revelation came in a report that Dr. Weber had obtained through her medical contacts. Allied forces had captured several of Klaus's rifles and subjected them to detailed analysis. Their conclusion was that the weapons represented a new category of battlefield technology, instruments so precise that they transcended traditional concepts of military equipment and approached the realm of surgical instruments. The Allied analysis noted that Klaus's hand-finishing techniques had achieved something unprecedented: weapons that were individually crafted rather than mass-produced, each one unique yet consistently superior. The report recommended immediate efforts to understand and replicate the manufacturing process, but also warned about the psychological implications of such precision for the soldiers required to use them. Klaus sat in his workshop that evening, surrounded by the rifles he had perfected through 18-hour days and obsessive attention to detail. Each weapon represented hundreds of hours of hand-lapping, trigger adjustment, and component matching. Each one could place bullet after bullet through the same hole at ranges that had seemed impossible just months before. But now he understood that his clockmaker's pursuit of precision had created something unintended: weapons that forced their users to confront the exact moral weight of their actions. His rifles eliminated the comforting uncertainty that had allowed generations of soldiers to function in combat. They made warfare too precise, too deliberate, too psychologically demanding for the human beings required to wage it. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. He had not created better weapons. He had created impossible weapons, instruments that demanded a level of moral clarity and psychological strength that exceeded normal human capacity. As the August night deepened around his workshop in Oberndorf, Klaus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He began systematically destroying his blueprints, his specialized tools, and every document that recorded his manufacturing process. The rifles already completed would serve their purpose in a war that was clearly lost, but no more would follow. He kept only one rifle, the third prototype that had first achieved impossible accuracy during that February demonstration outside Munich. This weapon, which had proven that precision could be conquered, he would preserve as a reminder of both his greatest achievement and his deepest regret. Years later, he would still taste the bitter knowledge that human ingenuity could make killing as precise as keeping time. The collapse came faster than anyone had anticipated. By April 1945, as Allied forces approached Oberndorf, Klaus had already completed the destruction of his workshop. The specialized tools lay broken and scattered. The blueprints had been reduced to ash. The knowledge that had revolutionized battlefield accuracy existed now only in his memory and in the rifles that had already reached the field. Dr. Elisabeth Weber found him on a cold morning, sitting among the ruins of his life's work, with his father's old workshop clock still ticking steadily on the wall. She had come to say goodbye. Her medical unit was evacuating ahead of the American advance, but also to witness what she somehow knew would be Klaus's final accounting with his creation. "It's finished," he said simply, gesturing to the scattered remains of precision instruments and measuring tools. All of it. In his hands, he held the third prototype, the rifle that had achieved something that bordered on the impossible during that February demonstration, the weapon that had proven precision could be conquered, that had spawned hundreds of copies, that had changed the nature of warfare itself. "What will you do with it?" Dr. Weber asked. Klaus stood and walked to the wooden floor of his childhood home, which adjoined the workshop. Using tools that had once belonged to his father, he carefully pried up several floorboards and created a hiding place beneath the foundation. There, wrapped in oiled cloth, he buried the rifle that represented both his greatest achievement and his deepest shame. "Let the earth keep it," he said quietly. "Perhaps someday, when I'm gone, someone will understand what we learned here." The years that followed were marked by silence and rebuilding. Klaus returned to civilian clockmaking, but his hands never regained their former steadiness. The tremor that had developed during his weapons work became a permanent reminder of the precision he had once commanded. He worked on simple timepieces, grandfather clocks, mantle clocks, pocket watches, instruments that measured time rather than ending it. Letters occasionally arrived from soldiers who had used his rifles. Most were brief, awkward attempts to express gratitude for weapons that had kept them alive, but others carried darker messages, confessions from men who had found Klaus's precision too heavy a burden to bear. Wilhelm's letter had been one of many describing the psychological weight of accuracy that eliminated all uncertainty from the act of killing. Klaus never replied to any of them. In 1954, he received an unexpected visitor. A young American historian named David Morrison had come to research German small arms development during the war. Morrison had heard rumors about a clockmaker who had revolutionized rifle accuracy, but the official records had been deliberately obscured or destroyed. "Herr Brenner," Morrison said in careful German, "I've been told that you created something remarkable during the war. Would you be willing to discuss it?" Klaus looked at the earnest young scholar and felt the full weight of his silence. For nearly a decade, he had carried the knowledge of what precision could accomplish and what it could cost. He had watched the post-war world develop new weapons, new technologies, new ways of making warfare more accurate and more terrible. "Young man," Klaus said finally, "some achievements are too dangerous to remember and too important to forget. The problem with precision is that it forces us to see exactly what we're doing. Sometimes that clarity is more than human beings can bear." Morrison pressed for details, but Klaus simply shook his head. The secret of his rifles would remain buried beneath the floorboards of his childhood home, waiting for a time when perhaps the world would be ready to understand both the achievement and its terrible cost. Klaus Brenner died quietly in 1967, taking with him the exact knowledge of how to make killing as precise as keeping time. His funeral was attended by a handful of neighbors and Dr. Weber, who had returned to Bavaria to practice medicine in peacetime. The rifle remained buried beneath the floorboards, but Klaus's legacy lived on in every conflict that followed. The pursuit of perfect accuracy continued in laboratories and workshops around the world. Engineers and inventors pushed the boundaries of precision, creating weapons that could strike targets from impossible distances with increasing reliability. But none of them had to live with the knowledge Klaus carried, that the smallest adjustments in precision could determine whether moments became minutes or whether moments became last breaths. The clockmaker's son had proven that human ingenuity could make warfare surgically precise, but he had also discovered that some achievements exact a price too high for any single soul to pay. In the end, Klaus Brenner's legacy was not the weapon itself, but the terrible knowledge that in war, as in timekeeping, precision could become a burden too heavy for the human heart to bear. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. How do we carry the weight of our creations when they exceed our ability to control them?